History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
And maybe some laughs along the way.
This is History's B-Side.
Today's B-Sider is the stepfather of evolution.
So today we're really fortunate to be joined by our friend James Reed. He's going to be guest hosting this episode. He was actually got in contact with us to suggest today's topic, and he seemed so passionate and knowledgeable about it that we just decided to invite him on and have a guest host here and mix things up. So James is, just to give you a little background on him before he starts us off, he's originally from rural Pennsylvania, now living in just as rural Vermont. He's currently an anatomy lab director who's involved in scientific outreach, and he's joining us from the Science Night podcast, which you can find at scinight.com. Welcome, James.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about the stepfather of evolution. But before we get into that, we got to talk a little bit about evolution. I can't just be a bad science communicator and not actually tell you what evolution is, because some people have different ideas about that, what that means. And most of this episode is going to talk about evolution by natural selection. But I think it's a good idea to go over what the prevailing thoughts were during the Victorian era, when people like Charles Darwin and the person we're going to talk about, Alfred Wallace, were coming up with their ideas. The first thing we have to talk about is creationism. And that is a list so long that we could not possibly talk about everybody on it, so I'm not even going to try. But there are two main people during the Victorian era that bear mentioning. And I have very strong opinions about both of them that I will try to keep hidden. So the first person is Georges Cuvier. He's a nice Frenchman with a nice French name. And he's most well remembered for his work in the field of vertebrate paleontology, which is the study of extinct vertebrates. A vertebrate is anything with a backbone. And then he's also well known for stratigraphy, which is the idea that different layers of the earth represent different times. And one of his pet projects was comparative anatomy, which was using the anatomy of different living specimens to kind of inform how development may work in them. And we use that today too, all the time.
It's really good that you're explaining all of these and define them simply for us, because we're kind of dumb anyway, but especially we're a history podcast, to get kind of a science angle on it is really useful to us.
You said stratigraphy, and I was like, that's how that's pronounced.
I said, did he pronounce that right? I've never heard that word.
Yeah. It's all about how you say it, not what you say. So kind of the infamous thing about Mr. Cuvier, probably doctor, why not? Is he was really well known for coming down hard on people who even came up with something close to evolution, or what he would have called transmutation, which is kind of a cooler name. I guess it's less Pokemon based at that point. And that's why the idea never really took off. He was like the giant of what would be called biology. It was natural history, I guess naturalism at the time. And he just kind of was a voice so large that no one dare go against him.
So it seems kind of wild that his criticisms were so harsh as to discourage all the other researchers. I mean, I know it was a different time where, even Newtonian physics or evolution are things that we today think of as kind of commonplace scientific knowledge were still budding. But can you summarize his main criticisms that he was so harsh about espousing?
Yeah. So they're not without a little bit of merit. So he worked with fossils, which were kind of a new thing at the time. We as a scientific community had just realized what they were. We thought they were anything from chunks of rocks to dragon bones in some parts of the world. But he argued that since the fossils he was finding just kind of appeared and then disappeared over time, that it was impossible for something to change into something else on its own. And basically he was bringing his biological hypotheses more into line with biblical creationism at that time. So he felt that only the hand of a creator could change a species.
So his objections to evolution or transmutation, or whatever he called it, were just based on religious objection. Did he have any kind of counter scientific evidence to justify his argument?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because he did feel like he was being very scientific about what he's doing, because he's using the research that he is conducting. What he's doing poorly as a scientist is looking at the evidence and using that to draw his conclusion. So basically, he's coming in with a conclusion that the hand of a creator is necessary for a species to change, and he's not allowing evidence, which was kind of scant at the time, to sway his opinion either way. So instead of going into these scientific salons with an open heart and an open mind, he was being very French about it.
Very French.
Yeah. And the other person, they used to call him England's Cuvier, and he hated that, is Richard Owen. He wanted to be more well known as England's Owen, but that just wasn't going to happen. So like Cuvier, he was a paleontologist. He was really well known for being able to interpret fossil skeletons, specifically birds, lizards, and fish. And he's the person who actually came up with the word dinosaur, which is cool.
What does it mean to interpret a skeleton or a fossil?
Right. So he was really good at looking at an arm bone, a fossil arm bone, because I guess take a step back. Fossils don't look as pretty as they do when you go to like the Natural History Museum in New York or the Field Museum in Chicago. So there's a lot of deciding what is fossilized bone, what is just rock, for starters. And then you have to be able to look at an extinct species and interpret what the parts of the body are doing. And to do that, you have to have a good idea of living species. And that's what Richard Owen was really good at. So again, bringing comparative anatomy into his work with paleontology. And he was less of a strict biblical, like Judeo-Christian biblical creationist. He was more of somebody who thought of the world in Platonic ideals or like Platonic forms. Unlike Cuvier, who did die, we'll give him a little bit of credit. He did die before Charles Darwin came out with his work. He also may be the reason that Charles Darwin waited quite a bit to come out with his work. But Richard Owen did come to accept the larger pieces of evidence that Charles Darwin was coming out with, eventually, kicking and screaming, but he did get there.
I'm familiar-ish with the Platonic ideals thing, but I'm a little fuzzy on. It's been like 6 years since I took an intro to philosophy course, but how did he suggest that the biological development was following the forms? Like, was he suggesting that species themselves were striving over time to reach those forms, or that they were created from those forms?
Yeah, it's actually instead of striving towards, it's the opposite. He believed that there was like these set archetypes, and he came up with the word archetype to decide this. So everything fits into these several archetypes. Specifically, he believed that all vertebrates came from the same vertebrate thing. And that's not unlike what we would talk about with natural selection. But where we differ is that he thought from that archetypal point, all of the changes were done by a god, or, well, he would not have actually used the word god. He would have used like universal energy or something like that. He felt that the energy within the species was this like universal form that was driving something forward. So it wasn't that the species themselves were striving towards something. It was that the universe was striving towards something, which is really out there. So the fact that you're able to get to that point, but not being like, well, over time things change, is a little remarkable. So, like I said, I got really strong opinions on Cuvier and Owen. They were jerks. They were not nice guys, but they were brilliant in their own fields. The problem with science during the Victorian era is that these natural philosophers or natural scientists were kind of responsible for everything under the sun. So they were expected to know everything there was to know about geology, biology, anatomy, these things that are separate fields. They were supposedly experts in all of them. And that comes through where you have people who know a lot about very specific things, but then they say wild stuff about other things. Not unlike Alfred Wallace, which we'll get into a little bit later. But the next thing I want to talk about is one of my favorite pet theories. It's obviously not something that is a credible hypothesis anymore. The evidence has moved us away from it, but it's kind of what you would expect the people that make Pokemon to have used as their model, and that's Lamarckian inheritance. So this is another good Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He thought that physical characteristics of the parents, and this is not the genes because they knew nothing about genetics at this point. So he thought the physical characteristics would be inherited by their offspring. And this would be like you getting braces so that your children would have very beautiful photo shoot ready straight teeth. And he loved using giraffes as his model for this hypothesis. And he thought that the kind of precursor species of what we would think of as a giraffe had a really short neck, and the act of stretching up to get leaves was what led to them having a long neck. This assumes something called orthogenesis, and that means that the species is driving towards a more complex form. And a good way to think about this is the March of Progress image, which you can see on coffee cups and mouse pads and t-shirts. And it is almost always a monkey turning into a chimpanzee, turning into a caveman, turning into occasionally Chuck Norris or whatever funny thing you want to add there. It is not scientifically accurate. It's usually a little bit racist too. But that's what we're thinking of there. Not to think that everything about Lamarckian inheritance is super problematic or anything.
I mean, if this was true, orthodontists everywhere would be losing their money.
Right. Yeah, we would have figured this out in the first time braces were invented. Like get it going and get it done.
Plastic surgery, there'd be no future market for it.
If this were true, I'd be 6'8", because I've spent the last 10 years trying to make myself taller around women.
How's that working out for you?
It's not. I'm still 5'6". So
yeah,
Lamarck was wrong. I haven't gained an inch.
Exactly. And this brings us to the actual thing we're going to talk about, natural selection, or Darwinian evolution. And the best way to think about this is descent with modification. And because we're calling it Darwinian evolution, obviously Charles Darwin came up with this and no one thought about it before him. It's not like you can look at ancient Arabic texts and see somebody like Avicenna say literally I think that species come about due to descent with modification. In the language of the time, he wasn't speaking in modern English, although he was pretty smart, so who knows?
If you're telling us that someone else came up with it way before Darwin, we're going to have to now do research for another episode.
Yeah. Well, Avicenna's not necessarily a B-sider. He's pretty well known. And another way, and a more popular way to talk about evolution by natural selection, is survival of the fittest. A lot of people don't think of fittest in a biological sense. They'll think like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Usain Bolt, like able to run fast, lift heavy things, that kind of thing. But what we talk about in biology is fitness, is the ability for things to reproduce. So for an adaptation to move forward, the species has to be able to pass those genes on in whatever way they do. So if a species is seen as unfit, that means that they either die before they're able to reproduce, or they are not able to reproduce successfully. So they have maybe they have a reproductive system that's overly complex and they just do not reproduce at a rate fast enough for the numbers to keep up. And if we want to use Lamarck's giraffe metaphor, giraffes with longer necks were better able to get food by reaching higher than the other things around them. So those slightly longer necked giraffes were able to pass on their genes, and those offspring with longer necks were able to get food and continue going on and on and on until you have what we have now. And a giraffe is definitely a species that you would consider a specialist because it feeds on one thing.
Do you see Lamarck's ideas as detrimental to the proper understanding of Darwin/Wallace's evolution? Because that's kind of what I'm getting as I read it. I feel like some of today's criticisms of evolution seem to almost muddle the Lamarckian concept without seeing the subtle distinction you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah. So not really. Talking about Lamarckian evolution is kind of a nice way to talk about how science actually works. Because you have to remember that science isn't a thing. There isn't a known quantity of science available to us. It's just
I would like
tool.
to buy one science.
Exactly. I'd love to sell it to you. But think of science as a tool that we can use to explain the world around us. Lamarck, he came up with an idea based on what he had to look at the time. Darwin was a follower of Lamarckism, and he was able to use the information that he then gathered to build on that hypothesis.
Okay.
Part of the thing that when you talk about the theory of evolution is that people think of theory as we would use it colloquially, not scientifically. So a theory is something that has been proven over and over and over again. It's the most rigorous term that we can give to a scientific hypothesis. Part of the problem is not necessarily that people are dumb. It's that scientists are bad at communicating their work. So
enter Science Night.
Exactly.
Right, that's what I was going to say.
That's
We need
right.
a podcast
Exactly.
to help communicate that.
And what we really need to get better at is kind of meeting people where they are, regardless of how scientifically fluent or what education level they get at. If you are an expert in your field, you should be able to communicate that to a kindergarten class. That's kind of where I'm at. I'm trying to be at the kindergarten level, as a good science communicator.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of kindergarten level education, I'm coming in here with a dumb question. So we use the giraffe analogy. Do giraffes have a significantly longer neck now than they did 200 years ago in Lamarck's time? Or is it a much slower process?
So they do not have a significantly longer neck than they would during Lamarck's time, but they do have a significantly longer neck than they would have had a million years ago. The precursor, last common ancestor to a giraffe and other things that are related to a giraffe would have had a shorter neck. But the thing to remember is that evolution doesn't fix a set of problems, and it doesn't adhere to a strict timeline. It's a response to the environment over generations. So some animals, like a fruit fly, have a very short lifespan. So they can start to show genetic differences over the course of a few weeks. And that would be in the gene lines, not necessarily able to be distinguished by the naked eye or even by a microscope. But in the genetic lines, you can see differences over a few weeks because they're mating and dying every day. A giraffe, and because of that, a fruit fly can adapt to the environmental changes really quickly. You can notice that fruit flies just kind of appear when fruit rots. So they're able to kind of adapt to that situation really quickly. A giraffe is, like I said, it's a specialist, and it also has a longer lifespan. So if the acacia trees that they eat in Africa were to die off in the next 2 decades, which is like a real possibility, the giraffe would not be able to respond to that on its own. And that is where you see extinction. Extinction events tend to happen with climate change. Spoilers, it's kind of a big deal in our work. So Charles Darwin is most well known as the father of evolution, or the father of evolution by natural selection. And his work as the naturalist, which was kind of like the science guy, or like a fancy science guy, because they're usually from the nobility, aboard the HMS Beagle, provided a lot of evidence that led to its widespread acceptance. But as we will see, there were a lot of other people who were starting to have these observations about the natural world, and they all came to a similar conclusion.
Well, you're the fancy science guy on our podcast, so thanks for giving us the brief overview. Why don't we take a quick break, and then we'll get into more of Alfred Wallace's story.
We'll be right back.
Matt, you like coffee, right?
I love coffee.
Would you ever want to buy me a coffee?
Anytime, Phil. Just say the word.
You know, our dedicated listeners could also buy me a coffee.
Could they buy me a coffee as well?
They could buy you a coffee.
This sounds fantastic.
We set up this service called Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
And people can buy us a coffee?
Yeah. It's really just a way for people to support the show if they enjoy the show. And if they're listening to the show, we sure hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, otherwise you're just, wasting your time.
At buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside, there's 3 ways that our listeners can interact with the show. Number 1, you can just donate to the show by clicking Buy Them a Coffee.
2, you can join as a member for $10 a month or $100 a year. Being a member gains you some pretty cool perks. You get access to our monthly bonus episode, History's B-Side Battles, access to our future episode queue, a name shout out on a future episode. We'll also send you a handwritten thank you postcard and sticker set, and more perks will be announced as we continue on.
There's also some different extras that people can get on our Buy Me a Coffee website. Things like choosing the topic for a future episode. If there's a lesser known person in history that you have an interest in, let us know and we'll do an episode all about them. You can also buy sets of custom postcards, sticker sets, and future merchandise that we add on there as well. Or you can draft your own advertisement script and we will promote whatever you want in a segment like this.
The website again is buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
Matt,
Yeah.
you owe me a coffee.
Oh. Do I get a coffee too?
You're buying.
All right. All right, welcome back. So we've heard from James a little bit about the foundation of evolution and also some competitive theories and their proponents. But now we're going to get to our main topic, which was a man that kind of sat adjacent to or across from Darwin in the exploration of evolution. So I'll let James take it away from there.
Yeah. I've mentioned his name a couple times, but we are going to talk about Alfred Russel Wallace. Insert applause effect here. There we go.
We're not that high budget of a podcast.
There you go.
We need a drum machine.
We don't have a soundboard or a live studio audience.
Yeah. I can get my 5-year-old to wake up and start clapping. I'm sure she'll love it.
We should have done this for our live episode.
Yeah.
So Alfred Wallace is a little bit more complicated than we probably have time to really go in depth. But I think a quote from one of my favorite scientific authors, David Quammen, describes him best. He said, Wallace's story is complicated, heroic, and perplexing. Besides being one of the greatest field biologists of the 19th century, he was a man of crotchety independence and lurching enthusiasms, a restless soul never quite satisfied with the place in which he lived, a believer in spiritualism and seances, a devotee of phrenology, a dabbler in mesmerism, a later apostate from Darwinian theory when it came to the development of the human brain, an opponent of the smallpox vaccination, and an advocate of nationalizing large private landholdings, who by these and other eccentricities gave his detractors some ground for dismissing him as a crank, which they did. The question that no scholar or biographer has adequately answered is how to reconcile such brilliant achievements, radical convictions, and incautious zealotries within one human character, the character of a consummate empiricist and field naturalist. If he hadn't existed, this Alfred Wallace, it would have taken a very peculiar Victorian novelist to create him.
First of all, he was an anti-vaxxer.
Was.
He's like the worst kind of person in 2021, right?
Yeah. I mean, you do have to remember that this was like the proto-vaccine, so a little bit of leeway on that one.
Like the Johnson & Johnson after it got
so he
recalled.
didn't think the government was just trying to inject him with a microchip?
Yeah.
What was his opinion on Bill Gates?
You know, if he would have had an opinion on microchips and Bill Gates, maybe there is something to the whole seance thing.
It's true. So, I mean, he sounds like a really eccentric guy. Were these eccentricities responsible for him being, kind of placed behind or forgotten behind Darwin?
Maybe. Yeah, he seems like he wasn't the easiest guy to love as he got older. He also really did defer to Darwin when it came to natural selection kind of generally. He saw himself more as an enricher of the theory of evolution rather than somebody who discovered it. So he was kind of weird, but he also didn't seek out to be known specifically for evolution. So that the answer is yes and.
He's like Darwin's hype man.
Yeah, exactly. And he was born January 8th of 1823 in the Welsh village of, I'm definitely going to say this wrong, Llanbadach.
That was good. I think that's probably right. I don't know how else you would pronounce that.
I can say the county, Monmouthshire. That's a nice one.
Nailed
That's
it.
a very English thing in Wales. And there's a little bit of debate on whether he's considered Welsh or if he is an Englishman born in Wales, which is apparently a distinction that matters to Victorian people.
He was also a very English thing in Wales.
Yeah. And the Wallace family themselves made that distinction even worse because they claimed to be of Scottish heritage, going all the way back to William Wallace, which is apparently somebody who was born in Great Britain's thing if their last name is Wallace. Every Wallace does it.
Do any of the countries actually claim him like as part of their heritage, noteworthy citizens,
So
maybe a hero?
Yeah, the problem is that all three kind of claim him a little bit because he is very well known in scientific communities. So he didn't have a problem navigating English society at any point in his life. He wasn't a wealthy person, but that was more because he was bad with money. He would have been considered a little bit more than what a commoner would have been. So because of that, it didn't really matter if he was born in Wales or if he was Welsh. But I think he considered himself English. Talking about how he was like not necessarily low born, but also poor. His father, Thomas, was notoriously bad at investing. He had lots of businesses. He was a lawyer at some point. He did some other things, and they always failed. Like the family was mostly on the verge of ruin his entire early life. He would start school and then be pulled out of it. He was sent to live with his brother at one point in London for a brief period. He eventually came back to Wales in 1836 at the age of 14, where he started working with his brother William as a surveyor. And it is this time in his life that went on to kind of build up these skills in surveying and map making, and that would be something that he could fall back on at different points of his life to either make money financially or skills that he would use in the field scientifically. From 1843 to 1845, mostly on the merit of the surveying work that he would do on the border of Wales and England, he was hired as an instructor of map making and surveying at the Collegiate School of Leicester, which was like a boarding school. It wasn't actually a college. This gave him access to the school reading room, which he used frequently. This was his first exposure to the principle of population by Thomas Malthus, which was something that if you wanted to be a Victorian academic, you were expected to read. If you read it today, you will think this guy is the worst, and please don't read it and think that we should do that. Full disclosure, I hate this. I hate this entire treatise. I tried to read it and no, it's real bad. So don't even do it. At this time, he also met Henry Bates, he considered himself an entomologist. I don't know for sure that he was really trained or if he just loved picking up bugs. But this was a friendship that would go on for years and years and years. And Henry Bates was always the person that would continue to keep him interested in the natural world. His brother William died in 1845, so Alfred was forced to come back and take over the family surveying firm, which immediately failed because Alfred, like his father, is really bad at managing a business. So to support himself and the rest of the family, he started working as a civil engineer in Neath, Wales. And this gave him free time to continue corresponding with Henry Bates, but also it gave him time to read a lot. This is when he really started working on reading a lot of the available work about the natural world. Specifically, he read The Vestiges of Natural History by Robert Chambers. This was a really popular book with the public, but the scientific community didn't really give him a lot of credit, specifically because this was still during the era of Georges Cuvier and Richard Owen, two notable curmudgeons.
So was the scientific community correct in hindsight to dismiss his work? Or, was their criticism scientifically sound?
Not really. So his work was good, but it had two downfalls. The first one is that it was mostly theoretical, which, no one really loves talking about theory at any point in their lives, but also because he didn't have a lot of that evolution. So it wasn't like experimentally proven, but he also didn't have a lot of evidence to support his theory. And that is something that Darwin notably took a long time to gather when he came forward with his idea of something that would be very similar. So again, we're being very scientific with these works in the fact that we're dismissing them now because we have new evidence, but they were not like a pseudoscientist at the time. So there was scientific merit. And this work specifically like fascinated Alfred Wallace. It started to popularize, because remember, this was very popular with the general public that were literate. So I guess not the general public, and if we're talking about Victorian England. But it popularized the theory of transmutation. And according to Darwin, this was the book that got people ready for his theory of evolution, or his hypothesis of natural selection. We're not calling it a theory quite yet in the timeline. The other thing he read was Principles of Geology, which just sounds like a real page turner, and that was by Charles Lyell. This is the book, and geologists still read this today. It is the book that kind of cemented the idea of uniformitarianism, which seems like something that you like attend on Sundays. But this is basically saying that natural laws that affect the planet, so the rocks and the soil and the things on the earth, the things that affect them today have always affected the planet. So if we can agree on that, we can start to use the rocks that we find and the evidence that we find in those rocks to learn more about how the planet works generally. And also he read this book called The Voyage of the Beagle by some guy named Charles Darwin, too.
So Darwin was already pretty established at this point. Like, he was working on his study of transmutation or evolution.
Yeah, so the thing to remember is that the most famous location attributed to Darwin's understanding of natural selection was his time spent on the Galapagos Islands. And he reached those islands on September 5th of 1835. At that point, Alfred Wallace was 12 years old. He just didn't tell anyone about it because, again, our two favorite villains, Cuvier and Owen, were out there slapping anyone down who tried to poke their head up and have ideas that were different than them. I'm really trying to make Cuvier and Owen this like perfect villain team. So hopefully Marvel is listening and they kind of take me up on it.
If Marvel listens to our podcast, they better start throwing us some sponsor dollars.
You're in phase 5. They just haven't released it yet. And throughout this entire time, he continued corresponding with Bates. And you'll remember Bates is the guy who is either an entomologist or loves bugs. I guess you can be both. And they kept on talking about these stories that these naturalists were coming at, because this was like the age of the traveling naturalist, which is, again, fancy guy aboard a ship. And they wanted to go out and do this. They were just, they didn't want to be surveyors or weird bug collectors in the British countryside. They wanted to go out and actually do this experimental biology, this naturalism at the time. So they decided to do it. Kind of on a whim, too. Like, there was not a ton of planning. And they set out for an expedition in Brazil, specifically the Amazon basin and the Rio Negro. In 1848, Bates and Wallace boarded the HMS Mischief for Para, Brazil, with the idea of exploring the Amazon basin. And they stayed together for most of that first year, surveying the Amazon River, looking at new species, meeting with the people of that area. In 1849, Alfred Wallace's brother Herbert would join him. Herbert Wallace sounds like a wonderful dentist, I guess, but instead he was a Brazilian explorer.
I'm going to use that as an insult for somebody's name sometime.
No offense to any dentists that might be listening to our podcast.
No, offense intended.
Wonderful dentist.
I just want to start a beef with dentists. Oh, And Herbert came all this way to see his brother, who's been in South America for a year, almost immediately became ill with either malaria or yellow fever or something that an Englishman would eventually die from. And he would eventually die of this tropical disease in Para, Brazil. And Wallace always felt guilty about this. For the rest of his life, he kind of like, oh no, I'm the guy that killed my brother. Because I don't think a name like Herbert Wallace is going to go to Para, Brazil on his own without any other things drawing him there. It's just the name alone is going to keep you out.
Not enough people that need dental work there.
Nope.
And other than being struck with huge amounts of grief, as we just talked about, the other thing that really dawned on him is that there was a huge variety of species. And this can kind of be chalked up to a couple things. One is he's in a new area, so everything seems new. And he's also in an area that is a lot different than the English countryside. And it's easy to think about like, oh, there's not a lot going around me because you're so used to it. You just don't see the variation in the world around you. But he's like in the rainforest, and there are bright colors and humidity and people that look different from him. And it's important for somebody in this work to go out and see these things. And of this, he wrote, even the fishes within the river differed. Those of the Amazon were peculiar to itself, but those of the upper tributaries were distinct. The number of separate species inhabiting the Amazon basin, he observed, must have been immense. He traveled and charted, again, surveying is serving him well, the Amazon and Rio Negro, and he noted the diversity of the plants and animals, as well as describing the indigenous communities he came in contact with. And the thing that really interested him was their languages. He is known as like an early ethnographer, not that he was doing it professionally, but an early ethnographer of the people of this region. His goal for this entire expedition was scientific and economic. So he wanted to gather as many specimens as he possibly could, gather as many notes as he possibly could, come back to England and say, I am here to populate your menageries with my specimens. I am here to populate your minds with my notes. I am now wealthy. What set this expedition apart from most naturalists is the time he spent with locals. He was poor, so he had to stay with these local indigenous communities just to get things like food and water and stuff like that. And most naturalists that were aboard a ship would come onto land, stay on land as long as the ship would allow them, but eventually they would leave. The ship's captain usually didn't really love the naturalist being aboard. If you would watch something like Master and Commander, it's pretty accurate. Like they're kind of a nuisance that the crown is forcing them to bring along. So they didn't spend a lot of time with local indigenous communities, and also like not for nothing, but they're British aristocrats, so they probably didn't give them a lot of value as well. So all in all, he spent 4 years collecting specimens, taking notes, and trying to build up this reputation to go back to England and become a real somebody.
How is he funding these long research expeditions?
Yeah, I totally wondered this myself, because there was like no planning. Wallace is terrible with money for his entire life. Bates is a little bit better with money, but also like not much of a pre-planner in this instance. And based on Wallace's and Bates' own accounts, which I read as much as I could, they just kind of winged it. They had a little bit of savings, but really they were dependent on locals for food and water and shelter. And convalescent time, because they were sick like constantly. They either had dysentery or a tropical fever. no one can see me. I'm doing scare quotes because it was anything from malaria to yellow fever to something else that I'm not an epidemiologist, whatever you would get in Brazil. He probably did. But he basically lived these 4 years as a backpacker. So he had a canoe, a load of journals, and then an area in Para that he could kind of go out and then come back and drop his stuff off, and then go out and come back again while he was accumulating all this stuff. And he did send some things back to England kind of like at the midpoint of this expedition as well.
His situation honestly sounds like a nice vacation, aside from the dysentery and yellow fever and Brazil stuff. But
What part is the nice vacation?
I don't know. It just seemed like being in the Amazon with the canoe and a backpack seems like it could be fun.
Definitely.
I mean, I have maybe a more adventurous idea of a vacation than most people, but I just feel like it would be cool to backpack through the Amazon.
I was thinking his interaction with the locals in Brazil is a little different than the interaction of the locals in Brazil, as we talked about in the Juan Sebastian Elcano episode.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure it was. The other thing to remember is, like, I'm saying he's getting dysentery and yellow fever and everything. This is not something that just happens to him in Brazil. This is like his entire career as a field naturalist. He's going to be sick most of the time. It's amazing he did as much as he did. So after like a really bad bout of dysentery, which I could only imagine if he's lived for 4 years with a mild case of dysentery, what this looked like, he is like, all right, I'm done. We're going back to England. He loaded up all those specimens he had. This is his future, those notes, those animals, and he goes aboard the HMS Helen, set to sail home to England on July 12th, 1852. And that's the end of the story. He's rich and famous for the rest of his life.
Oh, happy ending.
Yeah.
We never get those here.
Yeah. Actually, so August 6th, 1852, the Helen catches fire.
No.
And I don't know how much you know about fire at sea.
Surrounded by water, you should be fine.
Yeah. So it's not great. And I got a quote from a boat that is kind of like harrowing but sad at the same time, and I think it's worth reading. It's Alfred Russel Wallace stood in a leaking longboat of the brig Helen, over 1,000 miles from the port of Para, and watched almost everything he had collected or thought about through 4 years in the depths of the Amazon jungle burning before him. Flames leapt from shroud to shroud of the abandoned vessel. Monkeys screamed and ran into the heart of the fire. Fire roasted his collections below decks and ate at the masts until they fell. Only a single parrot, clinging to a burning rope on the bowsprit, dropped into the sea and was saved.
I feel so bad laughing at the visual of monkeys screaming and running, and
I would like to redact my statement. This sounds like a good vacation.
I was gonna say we have so many like terrible things happen on our podcast.
Really do.
Like people die on every single episode that we've done so far. This is the first time we've really had like bad stuff happening to animals, and I feel like the listeners are gonna feel some kind of way about it.
Come on, James. We've done genocide and slavery and racism and all kinds of terrible stuff, but we've never touched animals.
We don't abuse animals here. You're off the podcast.
Yeah. I mean, that one parrot was fine. I mean,
this really is a PETA expedition. The parrot got saved.
The caveat is like the parrot flew away, but he was in the middle of the ocean, so that parrot also died. I mean, let's be
Come on, man.
So they're just like hanging out in the middle of the Atlantic for 10 days on a longboat, but that's a rowboat. I mean, they're not something that you want to just cross the Atlantic on. And eventually, after 10 days, 10 miserable days, they were rescued by the HMS Jordison, which just happened to be making its way back to England. They were about 5 days away from Bermuda at this point, but they had about enough food for 3 days, so they were extremely lucky. The downside is that the Jordison was also like towards the end of its journey back to England from wherever it was coming from. So they also didn't have a ton of food, and no one was really happy for the rest of the trip back. So everyone was almost as miserable as Alfred Wallace. But he did get back to England safe-ish by October 1st of 1852. So he left Brazil on August 6th. He got back to England on October 1st. So it was like a bit of a struggle.
Not the worst sailing journey we've talked about on our podcast.
Definitely not the worst.
Not great.
Far worse than any of my experiences in airports, but
I
Oh,
don't know.
true.
When you get delayed and you're like on leg 3 of a trip,
it feels like being at sea for 2 months. Is that what you're saying?
and all the fast food places are closed in the terminal.
You have to remember, though, like, even on the Jordison, where they were on, like, an actual ship, they were low on food and water, and I'm guessing booze as well. So it's like the Looney Tunes thing where the person starts to look like a roast turkey. I'm sure that they were getting towards that as they got to, like, Portsmouth.
There were no animals left.
Yeah, the parrot's gone. You have to remember, like, this is not just a real bad crossing. It is the entirety of Alfred Wallace's career as a naturalist, except for a few notebooks that he was able to grab as they left the burning wreckage. He grabbed 0 monkeys, but he did grab a couple notebooks. And he was able to ship a couple things back, a couple specimens back to England. They were mostly beetles. So for the next 2 years, Wallace did basically whatever he could to raise funds, because, like, even though his expedition ended poorly, he was kind of hooked. So he sold the notes that he had. He wrote 2 books and 6 academic articles. Again, this is from like a handful of notebooks he was able to grab. So very productive time with that little bit of information. Think of what he could have done if he had absolutely everything. He really probably would have made a name for himself, because this work, while small in number, did allow him to raise enough money and also to gain the acceptance of the British Scientific Society as a serious naturalist. And he was able to mount another expedition because, like, spending 4 years almost dying and then really almost dying on the way back, the thing you want to do is get right out there as soon as you can, right?
And keep almost dying.
Which he would do. So this is going to bring us to the time of his expedition to the Malay Archipelago, which is modern-day Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. This is the period that Wallace is most well known for in the field of biology. And it also has his work from this time kind of affected the field of biology long term, kind of in the most profound way. I'll talk about the stuff that came about that later, but for now, just know that this is the major turning point in his career as a scientist. And Wallace is always in need of funds. He will continue to be in need of funds until the day he dies. So he was constantly sending specimens back to England for sale. And over an 8-year period, he collected just over 125,000 specimens. And several thousand of those were from new discoveries. And the biggest thing to remember for this expedition is that it is not just Alfred Wallace in a dugout canoe. It is a team of people that are trapping specimens and taking notes and working for Wallace. And he's selling and sending those back while he goes, rather than saving them up for one big shot back to England that will then catch fire.
So you mentioned when we were talking about the Helen, the monkeys and the parrots, was he actually selling live animals or just the evidence of the live animals? I mean, what was his purpose in having the animals with him?
Yeah. So he was selling live animals for sure. The purpose for those were, I mean, scientific, but mostly commercial, to populate the posh homes of England, and, you know, like the Crystal Palace, the menageries. Were zoos a thing by this point? If they were, then zoos. If not, then menageries and rich people's houses. And then he also would have preserved specimens. He collected a lot of bugs. Most of the 125,000 were some form of bug. But he would also get skins, pelts, bird skins, which is actually like every part of the bird but the innards. A lot of the preserved specimens are still available for study at the some Royal Society in England that I didn't write down.
Wow. So they still have the actual preserved specimens he brought back.
Yeah, specifically
That's
some
cool.
of the birds he brought back. Yeah, they're well known in the study of birds. I'm not well known in the study of birds, which is why I called it that.
Matt's
My
parents
dad
are.
is, so I will send him.
Yeah. I'm sure he's seen a Wallace bird skin. I think I listened to a
Probably not true.
podcast. I think I listened to a podcast about somebody stealing some of the Wallace bird skins to sell their feathers on the black market. So if that's true, you should listen to
That
that
sounds like an
podcast,
awesome heist.
which I have zero other information about.
We'll look for it.
On a future episode of History's B-Side.
Yeah.
The bird skin heist.
And like I said before, he was ill most of the time. It was probably a smaller number to talk about the days where he was not sick. In 1858, during a bout of malaria, so not dysentery this time, malaria, which is a little bit worse, he was pondering the work of Malthus. And here's our good callback from the time where he spent as a surveyor reading Malthus's theory on population. And again, I will say, Malthus is a terrible, terrible guy. He thought that population control was something that you should do and let poor people die, basically. That's what he's thinking about. But he's thinking about how Malthus is saying that poor people are going to die off if you allow them to. And he's thinking about how the entire natural world and paleontology at the time is riddled with death. Species go extinct all the time, even before we kind of like wreck their environment. And he was observing this. So he's thinking like, I wonder why some species make it. And he came up with this idea, and he quotes, "It suddenly flashed upon me that this self-acting process would necessarily improve the race, because in every generation the inferior would be killed off and the superior would remain, that is, the fittest would survive." And I really got to throw out the caveat that when he's saying race, he's talking about species in that point. So he's talking about like the race of the zebra or the race of the giraffe. I don't know why I'm talking specifically about African mammals, the race of the kingfisher. And this is like one of those moments in his own writing that he like sat bolt upright and then probably like passed out because he did still have malaria. But over the next week, he wrote an essay titled "On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type." And again, one thing you will also see is that as scientists, we are not great with getting these page-turning titles out. But he mailed this this treatise, I guess we'll call it, this essay to his colleague Charles Darwin to get his opinion.
So was he working with Darwin? They weren't rivals, even though they were working on the same kind of theories?
Yeah, you see that a lot where people will like put them as foils to each other. They knew of each other through their work, and they also, Charles Lyell, the father of modern geology, was a kind of a mutual friend. Darwin would send work to Lyell. Wallace would send work to Lyell. So they kind of knew of each other, but they weren't competing towards each other. You have to remember that Darwin was kind of working on his idea in secret, but he was working on it for 30 years at this point, 20-ish years at this point. He wanted to get it perfect, right? So they knew of each other's work, but Wallace, while he didn't have a great reputation at the time, he would have been considered a serious enough scientist that Darwin would have actually read the letter that he was sent, and taken it on its own merit. And now we're getting to the point where we're going to talk about natural selection, and it's scare quotes discovery, because natural selection was happening whether or not some dude from England said it was or not. That's the other thing to remember. Like, they discovered that this thing that's been happening since the beginning of life on Earth was happening. They didn't actually like kickstart it. People always talk about like, oh man, somebody invented oxygen. Like, no, they didn't. They just named it.
Newton, the inventor of gravity.
So this is the point where we gotta like briefly talk about the A-side guy, this dude, Chuck Darwin. And I'm gonna make it seem like Darwin and Wallace came up with this idea at like the exact same moment. But Darwin, like I said, has been working on this hypothesis for decades at this point. He probably came up with the term natural selection by the time his expedition on the Beagle ended, but definitely by July of 1837. And this is where he wrote like this famous note in his sketchbook titled "I Think," but it is like what you would think of a phylogeny tree, or when you see species connected by lines to talk about how they're related evolutionarily. And this is something that you see on, again, like coffee mugs, posters, and notably the flesh of evolutionary biologists that I know in the form of tattoos. They just love to get this picture. So go out and Google Darwin, I think, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about.
I looked it up. I was so curious after you said the tattoo thing that I had to look at it. I could see people getting that tattooed.
Sure. Yeah, it's like that nice line form tattoo that are kind of popular right now. And for like a ton of reasons, Darwin didn't want to publish his findings. And for one, he was also in poor health. Like, he was known for not being super healthy, not able to do the strenuous activity of sitting at a desk and writing. And he was also terrified that people like Cuvier and Owen would ruin his reputation if he dared stick his head up without the amount of evidence that he felt he needed to prove this hypothesis. So he went out and tried to gather as much evidence as he could. He worked with beetles. Famously in the Galapagos, he worked with tortoises and finches. He studied barnacles for a long amount of time, which is fine, I guess, but I don't know if it's like really setting the world on fire. And then some of the people that he would send his drafts to, they were urging him to publish this hypothesis because Wallace was also sending them drafts of his work, and they're like, "Oh, Chuck, it's looking real close. You need to get this out." And when Darwin received this letter from Wallace in 1858, he probably had a mild panic attack. I'm sure he cursed. If he's anything like me, he cursed a lot. But then he also decided that he should publish his work alongside Wallace's.
So it was more of a race to be first than the two of them really working together on this.
Yeah, so it was, I'll give Chucky D the benefit of the doubt and say that this is more like a conscious effort to publish their work together rather than just throwing the letter in the fire and publishing his own work. Because he said to people that were around him at the time that Wallace could have looked at his notebook and the potential chapter headings that he had in draft versions of his work and used that in his essay. It was that close. I want to be clear that no one was stealing from anyone. They came up with these ideas independently, but they were really close. And I think that actually is kind of a kind of on the plus side when you talk about the theory of evolution. If other people are coming to such similar ideas based on their observation of the natural world, that's got to be a good thing for the science of evolution. At least I think. And then July 1st, 1858, Wallace's essay alongside with Darwin's own work on natural selection are presented together at the proceedings of the Linnaean Society. And this would have been a thrill to Wallace because he is like the most serious of naturalists if you're having your paper presented at the Linnaean Society. He didn't know about it. He was sick with malaria in the Malay Archipelago. And I'm going to make a great effort to be clear that there was like no funny business here. Wallace was in Malaysia at the time. So while their work was presented together and Darwin did give him that signal boost, because Darwin was by far accepted as an expert in this field. He came from a family of naturalists, so it wasn't a big leap, but then his work, like I said, he was really concerned with getting evidence. So his work was always very kind of scientifically rigorous. But he was the only person there receiving any of the questions during this presentation. So, again, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, but you might start to see why we call it Darwinism at this point. And this encouragement that he received during these this reporting at the Linnaean Society, so like a lot of fun gentlemanly handshakes. We are in British society, so I'm sure a lot of knowing stern glances as well. That's all he needed to get the rest of his work out. And he went into like a writing frenzy. He edited and published the rest of his work in just about a year. So on November 24th, 1859, Darwin released his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle. You can see why we just call it On the Origin of Species, because he really lost the plot after that one. And we do have to note that Wallace is credited as a contributor to this in the introduction, because we all read the introduction to our books. And that's something that we definitely do. But the concept of natural selection was quickly and remains to be attributed to Charles Darwin. We don't even typically call it evolution by natural selection. We call it Darwinian evolution. We call it Darwinism, or we just call it evolution. And then everyone kind of went on the defense at this point, because there were still people like Richard. So Cuvier is dead at this point, but Richard Owen is still very much alive and still very vocal and still kind of a jerk. I'm assuming I can't curse, so I will I will keep it to myself.
I have. I don't mean to, but I have.
And it's really easy to think that Alfred Wallace was given a bit of raw deal here, because he was in Malaysia for the entirety of this, including the publication of On the Origin of Species. But he never thought about it this way. He would go on to dedicate his most notable work, which is basically the report of his time in the Malay Archipelago. It is titled The Malay Archipelago. He's very creative. He dedicated that work to Charles Darwin. He is so thrilled with the idea that their work is being accepted by the general public at this point that it's like, I don't care. It got across the finish line. That's all that matters to me. And the Malay Archipelago book is really popular with the general public. This goes on to inspire Joseph Conrad quite a bit. The nature part, not like the weird racism problematic parts, but it also probably inspired a little bit of that too. During this time, there are a lot of people who are very vocally defending the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin like kind of is, but he's also kind of frail. He's an older guy at this point, so he's not out there full-throatedly attending these debates. Alfred Wallace is. Another guy that you should all go look up is somebody called Thomas Huxley. He is like the Victorian English dude, also known as Darwin's bulldog. Think about like if Teddy Roosevelt was also a scientist and defending these hypotheses in debates. He had a very famous debate with our favorite foil, Richard Owen, and he challenged him to a fist fight. So there's that. And at this point, Wallace doesn't claim a ton of credit. He's always calling it Darwinism, and he acknowledges that Charles Darwin has been working on this theory for years, and he just kind of came on at the end. And that is very true. Like this is a process 25 years in the making. Wallace comes in the last year. He writes a book explaining natural selection called Darwinism. This is Wallace's most cited work, which if you're an academic listening to this, you're like, oh yes, this is the work, because we only need citations in life. That's what gets those checks coming in. And he tries to explain natural selection, and he like in it rejects Lamarckism. But he also talks about sexual selection a lot, and that's something that did turn out to be true.
Can you expound on that? What is sexual selection?
Of course, that's what you want to know about.
Yeah. So I'll do like the quick and dirty. Oh, not that kind of dirty.
There it is.
I'll do the brief surface level explanation, because there you get a PhD on sexual selection of some things. But basically sexual selection occur. Yeah. You can.
I should have gone for it.
Right? So sexual selection occurs when one biological sex exclusively decides which member of the species gets to mate. And then it creates competition for that opportunity, I guess, within the opposite biological sex. And this is one strategy that some species have for determining fitness or ensuring that the offspring will be the most fit. Some quick versions of this. A lot of birds have very, very visible and auditory expressions of sexual selection. Think like peacocks, who have these like great displays, but they also, like, the male peacock can't fly that well. But also anytime you think about a bird that the female's kind of brownish and the male's really vibrant, like a cardinal or a blue jay, that's an expression of sexual selection. And then a lot of songbirds, like a sparrow or a thrush, the vocalization, like the beauty in which they can vocalize, will attract the female. And then in like some bigger animals, think about like antlers, horns, in primates. It would be canine size or like a silverback gorilla. Humans, you might think that there's a lot of sexual selection, but biologically speaking, it's pretty random.
Guys above 6 feet tall.
Get out of here.
I will not get into the science behind human mating.
I read a little bit about it in preparing for our quiz, and it is true. The height theoretically should attract more because it may lead to a more suitable mate.
I'm worried what your quiz questions are, and I'm not even the one answering them.
The George Costanzas of the world reject your hypothesis.
I want to reject my hypothesis.
And, we talk about this as Darwinism, but there is some kind of hype around Alfred Wallace's work. There's something called the Wallace Effect, which is also way more complex than I'm going to say. But basically, if you have a species that for some reason separates for a long enough period of time, and then these two isolated populations come back in contact and mate, which is very important for this concept. Sometimes the population that comes from that, they tend to inherit like the worst, least fit aspects of both of the parent populations, and that will drive the population apart and create two distinct species that are then no longer able to sexually reproduce, which is one of the ways that we differentiate different things as a species. And this would have been really common in a lot of the stuff that Wallace was seeing in these island populations. So like birds and reptiles in the Malaysian archipelago, he would have been able to actually observe this.
So, I mean, this whole thing kind of makes sense, but why is it that the hybrid offspring would only receive the least useful traits?
Yeah, so evolution as a process doesn't really care about the species. It's just kind of tinkering with the genetics that are there. So sometimes when that happens, the hybrid offspring will receive beneficial traits. A great example of that is us. We have Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. If anyone does a 23andMe, it'll tell you how Neanderthal you are. You can tell by my prominent eyebrows that I'm very Neanderthalian.
I had some Neanderthal. I don't know where it expresses itself, but
Oh, you did one of those? I've never done that.
yeah, I wasn't like that surprised by it, but
You're a caveman.
no, I'm mostly Southern European, but I already knew that.
Yeah, that's where the Neanderthal comes in, because that is where
Grr.
they were. Yeah. So, you have the aspect where it's like not this Wallace effect, and the species kind of come together and they make a new thing. In this case, humans. Hold on. I want to make it very clear that we did not evolve from Neanderthals or Denisovans. There was just some funny business that was going along a long time ago. In the case of what Wallace was observing, they were not fit. So they, again, either died before they were able to reproduce, or they were sterile. So think of like a mule or something like that. If the species comes back together, that's called fusion. And if they move apart, it's called speciation, or the creation of a new species. And there's a ton of ways that we measure that. One of which is that they're no longer able to interbreed. He was also noted for applying the theory of evolution to humans, which Darwin would not do. And this is where he kind of becomes apostate, because he has some like weird views on brain evolution that are they're not great. So if you want to learn more about phrenology, I'm going to allow you to do that, but I am building Alfred Wallace up as a scientist, so I'm just going to ignore the rest of the facts like a good historian would. So at this point, European scientists, they would like to think of other races as groups that filled in evolutionary gaps between us and other primates. Wallace did not make this distinction. He liked to focus more on how our evolution went to focused on like the development of the brain, and also how we became bipedal, or how we walked on 2 feet in this evolutionary context.
Well, thank goodness we don't need to cancel him.
Yeah. Not yet, anyway. Although you read about phrenology and maybe you'll be right
He's
there.
getting there.
Yeah. He did make the mistake of bringing his kind of fascination with spiritualism, which is not like being moved by the Holy Spirit to stand up in church. It's like thinking that spirits, as in ghosts, can talk to you through a medium. So he would bring that into his work with evolution, thinking like maybe this unseen universal spirit helped with specifically human development. This is the point where I will remind you that Wallace is a complicated figure, as we all are. The problem is his evidence was flawed, but his hypothesis turned out to be pretty accurate as far as like linking brain development and bipedalism. So he was very correct in thinking that humanity is and always has been subject to natural selection. The potential that the brain and bipedalism is linked is something that one of my very good friends and Science Night podcast guest, Jerry De Silva, wrote about in his new book, First Steps. If you haven't read it, you should go read it right now. I'm not getting money for this, but, you know, Jerry's a great guy.
Jerry, you can address your check to History's B-side.
I just want a copy of the book.
Yeah, I'm sure he will
check it
sell
out.
one to you. Yeah. And you know, we're going a little long on good old Alfred Wallace, so I want to touch really, really briefly on some of the other stuff he did. He's really, really well known, like definitely an A-sider in something called Biogeography. And this takes like every piece of information you could possibly get about the ecosystem that natural selection is occurring in and creates like this model. And this explores how changes to the environment and isolation amongst groups can lead to new species, and then how those species spread out over the world. That's something called geodispersal, which is just that, how they move across the world. And then he also explored something called island dwarfism, which weird things happen evolutionarily on islands. Small things get really big. The world's largest rat is about the size of a medium-sized dog, and it lives on an
Bored.
island in the Pacific.
That's
And,
terrifying.
Yeah. And
Imagine a rat the size of Odie with his energy.
And then there's also like these really fascinating and hotly debated things called, you might have heard of them popularly called the Hobbits, but it's on the island of Flores in Indonesia. And they're basically potentially a smaller kind of island-sized version of Homo erectus, which made its way onto this island, and then the last glacial maximum ends, and all of a sudden this thing that was connected to the land is no longer connected to the land. There is also pygmy elephants on that island, so imagine an elephant the size of a medium-sized dog. So you have a rat and an elephant of the same size. Weird stuff happens on islands, and Wallace
You have a rat
can
elephant
observe
fight.
it. Yeah. I don't want to go to that fight. That's awful.
It is pretty terrible. There's a lot of animal cruelty in this episode.
I don't know. Is that illegal though? Specifically a rat elephant fight. Is that illegal?
Depends on your local jurisdiction.
Are we finding out why like popularly elephants are afraid of mice in like cartoons and stuff?
Oh, I didn't even think of that.
I think we cracked it.
This is a learning podcast.
His work in this field is most well known by something called the Wallace line, which in the Malaysian archipelago, there's this really deep trench. And at no point in the Earth's history was anything connected via land. So there's always this water here. And you can observe this by seeing that stuff on the Asian side, or the Asian continental side, tends to look more like stuff found on the Asian mainland, and stuff on the other side tends to look like stuff found on the Australian mainland. So he observed that there are these natural barriers to geodispersal, and it really kind of helped us understand how species get around things. Specifically, we're talking about land animals here. Obviously, fish can be anywhere there's water, and birds can fly to lots of different places. If you want to know a lot more about this, and this is not like a popular science book, it's a little bit dense, but The Song of the Dodo by David Quammen is really good at specifically explaining biogeography. Wallace is also really known for social activism. He hated the concept of social Darwinism. So even though Malthus and his work on population control is what drove him to natural selection, later in life he totally rejected everything about that. You know, social Darwinism, it kind of just states that those are in power are in power because they're better. You know, great people like Nazis and white supremacists and colonialists, they would use this to explain why they should remain in power. And Wallace hated this. He hated colonialism. He hated militarism. He spent a lot of time with local indigenous populations. So I can't help but think that that may be why he was driven to these anti-colonial views. And he was also pretty socialist too. Because he lived his entire life in some form of poverty or another. So he did not like the idea of large corporations. He was a very leftist gentleman, you could say. And then he was also a bit of an environmentalist. So we're now making Wallace the hippie. Very, very at home in my surroundings of rural Vermont. He came up with the idea of what we now call the Anthropocene. And he basically saw that the Industrial Revolution was having like pretty profound effects to the planet. And it's not hard to see how he came to that conclusion, spending years of his life in very wild, untouched by the Industrial Revolution parts of the world. And then going back to London, which is, you know, just as likely to be getting dysentery in London as he was in in the Malaysian archipelago. So, you know, that's where he is. So that is all the information I have to give you about Alfred Wallace. Noted scientist of the Victorian era, the stepfather of natural selection, and also like kind of a weird dude. So, you know, maybe that's why he's best suited to the B-side. But the B-side is where all the best songs are, right? At least that's what the dude at the record store always tells me.
Exactly. All right, well, we're going to take a short break, and when we get back, we'll get to our quiz.
Science is the tool we can use to explain everything in our world. But sometimes the information's delivered in a way that's hard to understand, misleading, or fake. Join me at the Science Night podcast as I talk with different scientists about their work in a fun way. Find it wherever you get your podcasts or at scinight.com.
Well, welcome back to today's quiz segment of our show. Normally we end our episodes with a short 3-question quiz for the host of the episode, just to kind of see how much he researched and knows about his topic, and give our listeners a chance to see how much they've been following along, see if they know a little bit about the topic before they heard all of this. I have to say, I think, James, you are way more well-researched and well-read on this topic than either of us have been on any topic that we've talked about on our podcast. I don't know how we're going to stump you.
Oh, until we get to the quiz part and we realize it's all a sham. Yeah.
I tried to dig up things that you didn't cover or didn't have in your notes, and now I'm worried that you maybe talked about something that we planned to ask you in the quiz.
Yeah, just cut that part out.
All right, so since we are both the listeners in this episode, we're each going to give you 2 questions, so you get a little bonus one, but you're an expert anyway, so it shouldn't be a problem.
Let's be careful with that whole expert thing.
We should give him a chance to fight before
I still
So
think
wait
he's
a
going to do
second.
better. I mean, we normally miss all three of our questions.
I was going to say, am I the first 4-question quiz? Could I go down in history as the highest score ever achievable in this format?
Thus far. Yeah.
I think
Oh,
I've
now the
given
pressure's
Matt
on.
a bonus question before, but I don't know that you've ever gotten 4 answers.
I don't think either one of us have ever gotten
3
all
answers.
3 questions and a bonus question right.
Well,
So,
if
yes,
I
you
do
could.
get one wrong, it's just because of that reason. I don't want to be the only 4 score here.
Yeah, you can't show us up. It's our show.
Yeah. That would be.
I'm
the
already
only
thinking
way.
about not publishing this episode.
I think if we're not measuring ourselves against your true best, then it's just an insult to all of us.
All right.
All right,
what
so
do
that
we
being
got?
said, we should get into our quiz. Do you want to take the first question?
Sure. So we've discussed a lot of different interests of Wallace, but one of them that I don't know that we talked about at all was an interest in astronomy. In 1904, Wallace wrote a book titled Man's Place in the Universe, which was the first serious attempt by a biologist at exploring what possibility?
Oh, it is our ability to live on Mars, right?
I mean, that's close enough to be correct. It's about the possibility of life on other planets, specifically Mars. So, I mean, yeah, basically.
You're being tough. You
No.
got that.
I mean, our ability to inhabit other planets is a bit different, I think, than other planets' ability to create their own life, right?
Yeah,
Ish.
true.
I mean, there's like
that.
I think you got it close enough to be right.
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
think
gonna
you
be
got
much
that
of a
right.
stickler.
Oh, no.
For our listeners' knowledge, after describing his logic using the accepted astronomical knowledge of the day, Wallace ended up concluding that there is not, nor will there ever be, another planet like Earth in our solar system, and that it's probably a rare few outside of our solar system that existed that could support life. Now, this was at a time when we didn't know other galaxies existed, and most of this was based on a planet's ability to contain water. Question 2?
All right. Well, my question is a little bit more biographical, or I guess related to his family. So I don't know that we talked about this in the last section, but Wallace had an engagement with a woman who is only known as Miss L, and it was broken off. And shortly after, I think within 2 years, he married a woman named Annie Mitten, who was the daughter of a botanist colleague. Alfred and Annie had 3 children together. Can you name the children?
No. Oh, definitely not. Was one of them named Charles? Was it like the ultimate call out to Charles Darwin?
Can I give him a hint?
That would have been awesome, but no, you can give a hint.
One of them would make a really good dentist.
Oh, was it Herbert?
Yeah.
Oh no, he felt real bad about that.
So he had 2 sons and a daughter. The sons were both named after 2 of his brothers, Herbert and William. The daughter's name was Violet. And Herbert, unfortunately, like his namesake uncle, died very young.
This is a depressing ending.
I know. That's why I didn't make it
we-
the last question.
Can we also just take a second to be like, how dare Alfred Wallace and his father name a child William Wallace? Like, what are we doing?
We had a guy a couple weeks ago, a topic that was a Scottish, I don't know what to call him, soldier, con man. He did all kind of crazy stuff, named Gregor McGregor. We had the same conversation, like, what terrible parents.
Oh no. What are we doing?
So for your third question, you mentioned several times Wallace's interest in spiritualism. In 1874, Wallace visited the spirit photographer Frederick Hudson, who captured a photo of a living Wallace next to which deceased relative?
Oh, I briefly read this. It wasn't his brother. Was it his brother? I'm going to say it was his brother.
It was not.
Was
It
it-
rhymes with
was
brother.
Oh, it is his
It
mother?
was his mom. Yeah.
Oh, man.
So I actually saw the picture, and it's creepy, but I mean, the story behind this is that Wallace totally believed that that was his true mother next to him in spirit, declaring the photograph genuine, and that, quote, even if he had by some means obtained possession of all the photographs ever taken of my mother, they would not have been the slightest use to him in the manufacture of these pictures. Despite that, Hudson's photographs had been previously exposed as fraudulent in 1872. So, I mean, you're right. He was a weird dude sometimes, because this guy who clearly just had fraudulent ghost photographs. I don't know how he made them, but...
Oh, if you want to learn more about this, dear listener, or both of you, or any of us, you should read The Vermont Ghost Experience by one of my dear friends, Joe Citro. And he talks about all of the fun things that spiritualists, specifically like mediums, would do. For that picture, it's just something called double exposure, because you just expose it to two different people and you get two images. Yeah. But just Google how mediums would produce ectoplasm. And
oh God, I don't know if I want that answer.
Yeah.
I have to look it up now, but I don't know if I want to.
All right, in your final question, we've tried really hard to stump you on this quiz segment here. In 1870, Wallace won a bet that disproved a 32-year-old experiment which stated what?
Oh, man. I have no idea. I've read something about this. I got nothing.
It was a bet.
Flat Earth. Was it a flat Earth?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh!
It was a bet over whether or not the Earth is flat. There was a flat earther named John Hampden who placed a magazine ad offering £500 to anyone who could prove the Earth was round over a body of water. So in today's dollars, it'd be worth about $66,000 in American money.
Wow.
So the story behind this, Wallace needed money for his research, obviously. So he took up this bet. He set two objects 6 miles apart along a stretch of a canal. They were mounted at the same height above the water, but when they were viewed through a telescope mounted at the same height, you could see that one object appeared higher than the other, which proved the curvature of the Earth. Someone with a science background, you probably understand and explain that better than I can, but I trust him.
Yeah. You could say the same thing on Reddit today, and they'd be like, no, do your own research. My camera can do things.
I've been watching a show on Netflix about the flat earthers, and it's fascinating. Like, just the ideas and the maps and how convinced they are after, like, this one guy was like, I was a normal dude, and then I watched a YouTube video for 15 minutes, and now my whole life is turned upside down.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I want to make fun of them so bad. I want to, like, just double tomahawk dunk on them. But that's what drove them to that ideology, right? Is that, like, people from a scientist background, just when they come up with that idea, because they're just, like, naturally skeptic people. I mean, I could say dudes because they usually are. They get kind of ostracized by the scientific community instead of the scientific community being like, well, no, and here's why. Plainly, it's kind of the problem. I need to take my own advice, obviously.
Well, just to wrap up this story, and kind of a testament as to how unlucky Alfred Wallace was, Hampden refused to accept the result of Wallace's experiment. He accused Wallace of cheating and sued him for the wager money. Now, Hampden was eventually imprisoned for threatening to kill Wallace and for libel, but the same court also ruled that the wager was invalid because Hampden had retracted the bet. So Wallace not only had to pay money back to Hampden, but ultimately he lost money on the deal in paying for the litigation fees.
Oh, I read about this. Darwin actually gave him money to settle the court fees for this. Darwin. Yeah, Charles Darwin bailed him out financially. Charles Darwin also is the reason that Wallace got a pension in Britain. So, again, Chuck wasn't the worst guy.
It wasn't a rivalry.
Yeah.
And also,
sort of.
See my comment regarding Reddit flat earthers.
All right, well, this has been really fun. I'm glad we decided to have you on, James. You were fantastic.
He got 3 out of 4, so he's still doing better than us on quizzes.
You have the best quiz record, and the most thorough, well-researched outline and episode record. So you've definitely set a high bar for us to continue to try to meet.
Thank you so much for being on our show. And again, anyone who's listened this far and learned so much about Alfred Wallace on this episode, please check out James's podcast, Science Night. You can tell them where it's available. We know it's on scinight.com, but tell us a little about your show.
Yeah, so Science Night is an opportunity for scientists to talk about their work, and then occasionally I will do an episode without a scientist when I can't book a guest or something, where I'll explain something as well. I try to keep it interesting and give scientists an opportunity to kind of tell their story in their own words, which is something that we're lacking. We have our Bills Nye and we have our Neil's deGrasse Tyson, and that's about it when we have people that need to talk about science. So just an effort to get other faces and other voices out there. So you can get that podcast at the podcatcher of your choice. If you can't get it on your podcatcher, let me know and I'll get it listed there. And you can also go to SCINIGHT, that's scinight.com.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. Thank you all for listening to our episode about Alfred Wallace.
We'll see you next week. History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service. And follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can donate to the show at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. While you're there, check out our membership perks, merchandise, and more.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
and Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.